All right, so the next one here, a U.S. official resigns over Biden's support for the Gaza slaughter. So Anel Sheline, who served as a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, has resigned from her post after a year due to President Biden's unconditional support for Israel and for what they're doing in Gaza. And this Anel Sheline, she actually worked for the Quincy Institute before she was in the State Department and wrote for Responsible Statecraft, and we've run a lot of her articles on antiwar.com. She was very critical of U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. So this is interesting to see. So she wrote an op-ed for CNN announcing her resignation, and she said, quote, "For the past year, I worked for the office devoted to promoting human rights in the Middle East. I believe strongly in the mission and in the important work of that office. However, as a representative of a government that is directly enabling what the International Court of Justice has said could plausibly be a genocide in Gaza, such work has become almost impossible. Unable to serve an administration that enables such atrocities, I have decided to resign from my position at the Department of State," end quote. Sheline said she did not initially intend to make her resignation public, but did so after being encouraged by colleagues in the State Department. She said, quote, "When I started to tell colleagues of my decision to resign, the response I heard repeatedly was, 'Please speak for us,'" end quote. So in this op-ed, Sheline cited Aaron Bushnell, who's a 25-year-old American airman who died after lighting himself on fire outside of the Israeli embassy in protest of U.S. support for this massacre that's happening. And she said that she was haunted by the final social media post of Aaron Bushnell. He wrote, I'm sure many of you are familiar with what he wrote. I think it was on Facebook right before he went to the embassy and lit himself on fire. He said, quote, "Many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery or the Jim Crow South or apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing a genocide? The answer is you're doing it right now," end quote. So this is an example of what he did having an impact on somebody. And Sheline, so she's the third U.S. official to publicly resign over Israel's onslaught in Gaza, which has killed over 32,000 Palestinians, as I already mentioned these numbers. And these are low estimates considering the thousands of people that are under the rubble that they haven't dug out. So we always have to keep that in mind, and the starvation deaths and everything else. So she's the third, and she's the third official to do it publicly, the third official that we're aware of. Josh Paul, who worked in the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs, he quit back in October, and he criticized the U.S.'s blind support for Israel. Tariq Habash is a Palestinian American who worked in the Education Department, and he resigned in January. And he was actually a Biden political appointee. So he told Al Jazeera asked him for a comment on Sheline's resignation. And he said, quote, "It wasn't surprising that she felt like the only way that she can make an impact is by leaving, because in almost 6 months, we've seen no substantive change in policy, and our influence at the international stage seems to be disintegrating by the day," end quote. Sheline said that she and other federal employees had tried to influence policy, both internally and publicly, but that it failed. She said, quote, "My colleagues and I watched in horror as the administration delivered thousands of precision-guided munitions, bombs, small arms, and other lethal aid to Israel and authorized thousands more, even bypassing Congress to do so," end quote. So then I just mentioned at the end of the article here that before she was at the State Department, she was working for Quincy. And I wonder, I mean, she didn't mention anything about Yemen, but, you look at the state of things in Yemen, and she was very opposed to the U.S. supporting the Saudi war, the brutal, horrific Saudi war against the Houthis in Yemen, killed hundreds of thousands of people, starved to death hundreds of thousands of children. And now the state of things, there's been the Saudi Houthi ceasefire, but now the U.S. is bombing Yemen, and in a bombing campaign that's not supported by the Saudis. They don't want anything to do with it, and new U.S. sanctions are now blocking a peace deal in Yemen. So I'm sure she's not happy about that as well.